We are on the clock in a Dynasty startup draft. We're going to talk through the player decision because maybe we don't agree on who should be that next selection. But even more fun, Shawn, we are recording this on Wednesday. This will come out on Friday. The reason that we have done this delay in releasing it is we have had 5 picks in a 13-pick range here from 8-12 through to the 9-12. But we are on the clock at the 9:03 at this particular point in time, and we have those 4 additional picks going over the rest of the round. We want to talk through our strategy, but when we record these shows, sometimes we release them immediately after, sometimes within 30 minutes. And if we do that on this particular one, Shawn, those picks that we are going to have, our leverage will be gone for both the picks and also for any potential trade back and maneuvers that we might make. So this has been a draft that we're doing along with the RotoViz Overtime listeners. It has been a huge amount of fun. Massive amount of trades involved, as you would expect. But what we did over the course of the last 24 hours was we accepted a trade that moved our future first from 2025, got us 2 more picks in this 9th round range. And Shawn, it felt like, because people know that we like to keep those future picks and like to stockpile those future picks, it really felt like the law enforcement was clamping down on us from the rest of the group, wondering what are Shawn and Colm doing as we traded away that future first. And obviously that's going to be part of the discussion that we get into here, because part of the reason we did that was to pick up these additional picks. We obviously now have a huge amount of picks through the first kind of 10-11 rounds, which is going to set us up hopefully with a pretty deep squad, but also with a lot of young talent. There's only really one player on this team that I would say is like a multiple year veteran. We have some 3rd-year players in here. Jerry Jeudy, Shawn, the player that we did draft last, being the oldest though off the entire crew here. But I think we're, with the strategy, we had to be a little bit different in this league because we're drafting against the people that know what we're looking to do. But one of the things that we did was trying to trade back, which we talk about often being a superpower. We traded out of the first round. We traded out of multiple of the early rounds. We had no pick in the first round, the 4th round, but then we started to have more and more picks in every single round. And that's going to lead to us having these huge chunk of picks throughout the 8-12 through the end of the 9th round. We have 2 picks in the 11th. And then that means that we don't have any picks 17, 18, 19, or 14, 15. But we are front loading the roster, Shawn. And one of the things that we talked about when we were having discussions about, when we were moving our first round pick this year to drop back was, somebody who's given up future picks. If they were to win this league this year, that future pick obviously would become less valuable and it would turn out to be a brilliant masterstroke by the person moving up. One of the things we have talked about as well is we have drafted a very young quarterback room. We have Jaden Daniels, Bryce Young, and Bo Nix. So that also means us trading away that future first could lead to, if those quarterbacks don't hit this season, us having a potentially very valuable pick that we just traded away in 2025. So there's a lot to get into here before we even discuss the players that we may be looking to take. Or I think what we'll do at the very end of the show is make the pick itself. Just general overview, Shawn, on our draft so far, the strategy that we have built out. At this particular point of the draft, we do have the 3 quarterbacks that I mentioned. We have 2 running backs in Travis Etienne and Kenneth Walker. We have 4 wide receivers, JSN, Jordan Addison, Christian Watson, Jerry Jeudy. And I think it's, it goes without saying that we have Brock Bowers on this roster. But I think the team, there's a strategy behind it. There's a youth building element to it. Something that I like to mention sometimes when we look at teams that come in from listeners is that sometimes a team can arrive early. And this is a team with a lot of youth on it. But the plan would be that, there is still a possibility that it could arrive early this season. But it is more one that we're looking ahead potentially to future years, which then comes into that interesting conversation about trading away the future first. So take it whatever direction you want, Shawn. There's a lot of stuff that I've mentioned there.
Well, as we mentioned on the previous show, we're going to have 17 picks in the first 11 rounds. And what you're hoping there is to generate a huge amount of embedded future trade value. And at the same time, have positioned yourself very nicely with the type of redundancy to overcome some misses, to overcome some injuries, and to have either certain enough players arrive early or some guys who are going to come in this range between 8 and 11 that round out the roster for the first season and allow us to win while we be patient with the rest of the team. Now, one of the problems there is just that if you don't get enough QB scoring, it's going to be difficult to do. However, as we've mentioned many times, you can play a different position in the Superflex in this particular format if that player is actually going to score enough points. So that would be another possible path. The thing that is tough is that you look through this draft, and we went ahead and took Bryce Young in the middle of 7. And the reason that you do that is because if you are right, the rewards are astronomical. Now, you're probably with Young not ever going to get a guy who is a clear-cut first-round startup pick without the rushing ability. And yet, if you have a player who moves into middle to late round 2 and scores consistently for you for the next 15 years, then what you have won with that pick is so outsized that you can withstand initial year scoring problems, and it's going to swamp the concern that he's a bust, because that's a very real possibility still. I have a piece from last year when we were talking about why you wanted to go for some of the late QBs, discussing how so many of the young quarterbacks, including the guys who were drafted very early, they made a big jump when the team added weapons. Well, the Panthers have done that this offseason. They have hopefully improved, but certainly changed what the coaching staff is, the makeup there. So there's a possibility for a big jump. The trade-off when you're working through that and when you have then subsequently moved your first round pick is that the next 2 selections at QB were Kirk Cousins and Deshaun Watson. And those quarterbacks are positioned to absolutely crush Bo Nix and Bryce Young from a 2024 scoring perspective. So you're giving up a lot of points. And there's no reason to necessarily believe that Kirk Cousins and Deshaun Watson are just 1 or 2 year plays. I mean, Watson, if he rehabilitates his play, could be a good quarterback for a decade. Kirk Cousins probably has 3, 4, possibly 5 years here. So I think those selections are really strong. They go to a team that, as the draft evolved, went ahead and took some veteran options. When we selected Travis Etienne and Kenneth Walker, the guy that we passed, which again, I think is set up to be potentially the biggest mistake, the guy that we passed was Kyren Williams. And there are reasons for that. And yet again, when you look at 2024 scoring, for that player to go to a team that set themselves up very nicely with CeeDee Lamb and Amon-Ra St. Brown, one of the things that was interesting to follow in this draft was the different dynamic between teams that went with foundation quarterbacks and teams that went with foundation receivers. I mean, this team has accomplished both, right? You've got CeeDee Lamb and Amon-Ra St. Brown. Then you set yourself up with Jared Goff, Kirk Cousins, and Deshaun Watson at QB and don't spend up. And that's one of the things that we discuss all the time, Colm, and I think was just magically executed by this squad, where they have a lot of firepower at QB and did not really pay for it. Right? That's the perfect beginning to a team. And then you have Kyren Williams, and then because you see how the draft is progressing, you go ahead and add Devontae Adams and Cooper Kupp. And this team has got to be not necessarily the clear-cut favorite, but it's going to be one of 3 or 4 teams that look like the favorite based on kind of where they're pointing their team. But it doesn't have to be a team that is just pointed at the first season.
I would agree with a lot of that. The one part that I would say is, if we do get into a situation where there's regression, I think the prices that they've actually paid for Adams and Kupp and for both quarterbacks even allow almost for that regression to happen, or what I mean by that is their value to regress as they obviously continue to get older. But they also, with the CeeDee Lamb, Amon-Ra St. Brown picks, it gives them such a foundation to then you're either investing at the wide receivers and that 1-2 rounds, or else you're investing at the quarterback in general, and they've done it as well as anybody at those particular 2 spots. I mentioned us not having picks in a couple of the rounds. They had no pick in round 3, round 5, so they're and they've no pick in round 9. You have to get that balance. There's going to be spots then in the draft where you can't make picks, but I think they've set it up pretty nicely so far through that opening stanza. And it's I think you've set it up well, that it's a different approach than what we have taken ourselves. But you mentioned the 17 picks that we will have. You're looking at it's a bit like if you think of it as a redraft or best ball. If you could take if you could take the majority of your picks and have them from round 6 through 10, like, your team would look a lot better than if you're filling one from every round. There is times you wish that you had that additional pick. So in this draft, being a startup, it is that opportunity. The other part, Shawn, trading away the first, we didn't want to, obviously, if we could have avoided it, we would have. But I think what's going to happen is that hopefully the players that we're going to select here either hold value or increase in value over the course of the next kind of 8 to 12 months. What we have also done is we do not have the first round pick next year, but we have 2 seconds, 2/3, a fourth, the fifth, the sixth, and the seventh. So we have those additional picks in the third and the second. We do miss the first, but there is also the possibility with those 2 picks that we picked up in the 9th round that those players may be tradable for a future first when it does come to that point in time. I guess the question from the rest of the draft was, why did we trade away that future first? That would be kind of my part of it, is that you can now add the depth and what should be high-end depth to the roster here. And sometimes when we're looking at, our roster, Shawn, and Dynasty, it can be a case that when you're building them out, it takes time to build that kind of core. And while we may not end up having the high-end upside in terms of what we've invested draft capital in, the likes of Daniels, Brock Bowers, JSN, I think they're all players that are going to ascend in value again this season, and they'll push themselves up into that, 1, 2, 3 rounds of the startups for 2025. So I think that we will have those core pieces, but as people look at it now, they may not see them in that particular same light. But then to be able to go through this 9th round up through the 11th round with the picks that we're going to have, I think that you're going to have a huge amount of depth where you can kind of, when there's bye weeks, when there's injuries and so on through the season, you'll be able to weather that storm where some of the teams that have drafted more so in the high-end capital and drafted to move up draft boards, they may find that challenging when it comes to setting lineups in those particular weeks.
Exactly. So we hope that we're able to build out the roster through volume. And how we accomplish that, when we were in round 4, we had the 408. We moved that pick and the 808 for the 506 and the 602. Then as we get in the middle of the 5th, we have the 505. We're looking at JSN still being there on the board. Other players of interest were there as well. The next 4 picks after that, T. Higgins, DK Metcalf, DJ Moore, Jaden Reed. There is a decent possibility that JSN makes it through those next couple picks, or that if you miss out, you still are better off with those other 4 guys. We didn't want to risk that. Colm, I have a almost 6,000 word piece out on the Seahawks offense. Anyone who wants to get into the deep dive there, I think there are some pretty compelling reasons to create some exposure to the Seahawks. And frankly, one of the things that, we also have made sort of a foundational principle, or certainly at least a guideline, is that you want to be careful about taking your third QB, because that then limits you to only 3 positions. And if you get great values on the final QBs late, you can't take advantage.
And that was something we did talk about with the young pick. But when we were at that was in the 705, when we did take him, was our 3rd quarterback. It still felt to me like the right decision to take him there with the upside that you've talked about earlier in the show, rather than wait to see what other additional options will be there as a 3rd choice.
And so I was hoping that we could land Geno Smith as our 3rd QB, save a lot of pick value, and have someone who would potentially push us over the top and help us win in year 1. We'll
Interesting
see.
question for you now, Shawn, is one of the reasons that we ended up making the selection is we weren't able to move back. We couldn't get any trades worked out to move back. When I look at the draft board, the other player that probably could have been a selection, maybe James Cook, the tight ends that went shortly after that. The players that went after were James Cook, Travis Kelce, Christian Kirk, George Kittle, who I'm growing more and more fond of as the weeks move on here. And then we get Terry McLaurin, Kirk Cousins, you mentioned Cooper Kupp. Then we drafted Christian Watson. So I feel like the next step after the Bryce Young, my pitches would have probably been Kittle, who doesn't fit the overall construction that we've been building out here, or Christian Watson. So I'm just, the part is that we could have waited, but who would have been your selection in hindsight now as we see the picks that have gone over the last round?
The two ADP values were James Cook and Travis Kelce. They were the next two players to go. I don't think that they fit what we were trying to do. No. James Cook is an interesting play. Obviously, he's going a little bit earlier than Kenneth Walker in seasonal leagues. I think that Walker is a much bigger talent. There's potential for the Seahawks offense and specifically running game to create more total points. Cook is somebody I do like in redraft. I do like his talent. I say Walker's a bigger talent. One of the reasons we made that pick is we just think he's more of a third round type of talent. There are contextual issues that work against that, which is the reason he would fall to that pick at the 603. Cook is somebody who, even at his age, I think his ability to hold value over multiple years is very much in danger. And so to get to a third running back at that point was not the right move for us, even though Cook is a good pick there. You mentioned some of the other receivers who went. We end up going half a round later with Christian Watson. I think that's the right play. The other interesting guy there for me would have been Deontay Johnson, in a similar vein to a few of the other things that we'll talk about and look at in terms of guys who really could play for another 5 years at a pretty high level and allow you to accomplish your goal of winning right during that time period. As we continue to sort of move back, then we have the 506. We trade it in the 1408 for the 512 and the 1112. So we're able to move up from that 14 range into 11. A few picks later, we have the 602. We move that in a couple of late picks for the 801 and the 912. Colm, that's an interesting area to look at because the 602 becomes Ladd McConkey. And one of the reasons that we were able to move out of this area is that we had 4 picks in a row. We didn't really want to take all of them. We had ETN, Nix, Walker. We really wanted to move one. I say that even though I think we probably would have taken Kyren Williams, which would be an interesting 3-player running back attack. Again, Kyren Williams, if you miss on one of those QBs, it's very possible that he's a better super flex starter than the bottom half QBs are. That would have been a compelling pick. You contrast what we lose there in the chance to take a Ladd McConkey or a Williams or a Brian Thomas or a Deebo Samuel. Those were kind of the 4 guys outside of our picks who went in that next area. We get to the 801 and we take Christian Watson, and obviously the 912 is one that we will be making in the next 24 hours or so. McConkey versus Watson will be an interesting player to track. So, Colm, I think that gets us to the point here where we are ready to work through this round 9. The other guy that we did actually just take in there was a Jordan Addison. So our receivers are JSN, Addison, Watson, and Judy. I like that mix. I may be a little bit too high on a couple of those guys. We'll be talking more about Jordan Addison and why even with a suspension, he's going to be a big deal in both redraft and dynasty going forward. The picks right ahead of us, we have Josh Downs. He was having a fantastic camp before the injury hiccup. We have Ben Sinnott, somebody that you and I have referred to as the next Sam Laporta. And that pick does come one spot ahead of ours, which is smart, right? You got to get in there.
This was a tough stretch. This was like they were two players that I was thinking that in this, I guess glutton of picks that we have in round 9, I was thinking like they're two of the names we can pick up here, but they obviously went.
While you were asleep, I grabbed Jerry Jeudy. Amari Cooper was the 901, and then Javonte Williams was the 902. Williams would have been my selection if he had made it one more pick. Colm, you have floated a couple of running back names in Jaylen Warren and Chase Brown. Give me your best pitch on those two running backs and why they are a good fit for our current roster.
I think that the reason that they're a good fit is like profile-wise, age-wise, and so on. They come in. Do I want to be adding in a third and fourth running back over this particular portion of the draft? Probably not. But in terms of best player available, I think that they're the ones that fit in here for the build. When we look at the players, by ADP that are available, Josh Jacobs, Trey Benson, Rashad White, Evan Ingram, Derrick Henry, Joe Mixon, David Njoku, DeAndre Swift, Ramondre Stevenson, Chris Godwin. Then we get to Blake Corum, Tyjae Spears, Alvin Kamara. That's kind of the next list that's here. And as people listening and hearing me talking through those, obviously there's a lot of those guys that are either veterans or even, pushing past that age cliff, either running backs or wide receivers. Godwin, obviously in the past, Shawn was one of our favorite guys, but now obviously pushing up in terms of his years. There is a couple of tight ends that I think are interesting in this range, but I feel like they're more of the potential pick targets at the back of the round here rather than at this particular spot. Those two players, though, Shawn, in terms of like what we're looking at for 2024 and what they could be entering 2025, I think there's a floor there where they're having that standalone value, and they also have the ability to potentially go in there and become starting back for either the Bengals or the Steelers in this particular situation. And that would lead to a large increase in value because of the profile of their skill set and also because of the age profile they would have. So you could draft them, use them, and as we talk about with the perpetual reloading window, you could move back out of them. And I think that's what Walker and ETN are offering us as well at the running back position, although ETN and Walker, I guess, has had his injury issues as well that may dampen some people's hopes, as they get older. But that would be why I'd be going for both running backs. I feel like this is a real running back heavy zone in terms of the other players. Like the next options that I'm kind of looking at would be Spears and Benson. I think that Benson offers less 2024 value. We talked on the show on Wednesday about, we're both drafting quite a bit of James Conner, and Spears also fits into the kind of same category as the other two guys, but I have them just slightly ahead of him for this season. So I'm interested if any of those names are the names that you're talking. Is it even a running back? Are we looking at a different position? What are we thinking about here, Shawn?
This is a fascinating area because it's not clear what advantages outweigh other types of negative trade-offs. With Jaylen Warren, we're going to get extremely high quality running back play in 2024, but he is in a committee. He does have a poor coordinator. There are questions about whether or not he will have a rushing quarterback, and he will turn 26 in November. All of that combines to make him more or less a single-year play. A single-year play at running back at this juncture of the draft isn't necessarily a problem. We just want to be clear that we're making it as a one-year play. You look at the guys who are at the top, Josh Jacobs, that same basic age, he would be a one-year play and probably a worse one-year play than Warren. Henry, obviously a one-year play at his age, but maybe a better one-year play than any of those guys. The name that you didn't mention, who is arguably a little bit interesting, would be a DeAndre Swift, their with the Chicago Bears. Again, more or less a one-year play. Chase Brown is a name that's very exciting. It does seem like he could be the starter for the Cincinnati Bengals, could score a lot of points. He's 24. And one of the issues with almost all of these guys, Colm, is they are already aged out of the time frame where you could draft them and play them for a couple of years and then trade them as a peak kind of guy. They're going to be seen almost instantly as post-peak, or someone who is just, again, a one-year play, which at the running back position is fine. But I think we have to, in many ways, look at all of these guys as somewhat one-year plays. Tyjae Spears is interesting. He's a little bit younger, which does potentially help, because you're looking at next year, he's 24, and there are going to be some managers looking at a 24-year-old, especially if he goes off, and they say, that's a good play. He has some room to hold or grow even without a fantastic year. But then our trade-off there is, does he actually help us very much in 2024 in what could be a committee in a bad Titans offense? So as we work through all of those guys, my question for you would be, when you compare younger running backs to a slightly older receiver, but knowing the different ways that fantasy managers approach the positions, and knowing that 24 to 27 for a running back in many ways is going to be viewed similarly or less positively than, say, 27 to 30 for a receiver, given the goal of winning in year one and knowing that we're going to have these additional running back options as we go through the round, how much does a name like Hollywood Brown appeal to you? A 27-year-old who, we don't like him as much as Rashee Rice and Xavier Worthy. And so in some ways, you're going to be rooting against your interest in other leagues. But it would seem like Hollywood Brown has the potential to score a ton of points, to help us fill the receiver position, the flex positions, win this year, and be looking at more value next season, even as his overall future is a little bit murky.
If I'm saying, like, if we're looking at veteran receivers, I think I would rather have Chris Godwin than Hollywood Brown. I think that all the stuff that we've mentioned there about running backs and how things could go, like, I think we could be in a situation where if Rashee Rice's suspension isn't as long as maybe it could be, and then Worthy comes in and we're seeing positive reports about him at the moment, we could see this be like the last stop for Hollywood Brown. The lights could be getting turned off here. It could be the no more lights, camera action for Hollywood. And that would be a concern for me, is the potential cliff for him could come after this season. Like, he's been in a few places and they have either not kept him or moved him on. And that could really be a situation where the Chiefs are having him in there for this season as a veteran presence for the younger wide receivers. But if those younger wide receivers are better than him, it could be, a real dagger to his value moving forward.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. And one of the issues that you're dealing with there as a dynasty manager is that he's only tied to the Chiefs for 1 year. If he had a breakout season, they would probably find a way to keep him, even if they also like what Rice and Worthy are giving them. But you have to deal with that. I think that for me, partly it's that with or without the Chiefs, if he blows up this season, you're looking at a jump in value. I don't see any way that, I shouldn't say that. We've always loved Godwin. He's a year older. Next year, he will be 29. With Baker Mayfield as the QB, and with Mike Evans, and then,
I know what you're saying is, like, you don't see Godwin increasing in value the way that Hollywood Brown could increase in value. I guess what I'm saying is, like, Hollywood Brown has a wider range of outcomes in terms of completely crater in this season and being worth very little at all next year. I don't think that's the same for Godwin. So the range of outcomes for Godwin isn't as high, but it certainly isn't as low.
And I guess I like making the bet on the younger player with the higher upside. I would be disappointed if Chris Godwin got into our lineup very many times this year. He doesn't seem like a player who gives us anything.
I guess
maybe that's underselling
him
a little bit, but I would rather just have a running back than Chris Godwin because he's not going to be a fantasy riser, and his outcomes are not clustered in a range that help us win a fantasy football league.
It sounds to me like you're talking about Hollywood Brown, Shawn. I think
so we have a little bit
of opinion on the two players.
Colm, what are you thinking about the tight end when we look at the overall ADP here? Evan Ingram, someone who could be a big deal in 2024 for winning leagues, would give us a little bit of a backstop to Brock Bowers. David Njoku, a little bit younger and potentially a breakout star in this offense in 2024 as he builds on the second half of last season, where it's easy to miss with David Njoku when we think about everything with Evan Ingram from a full season perspective, with everything that Trey McBride did, that Njoku's second half rivals McBride.
But the thing with Njoku is like the majority of that production came with Joe Flacco.
But Joe Flacco is terrible.
Yes, and so is Deshaun Watson. So, there's a lot of terrible quarterbacks. I don't know if they're all going to have the same, ability to really push the ball downfield the way Joe Flacco had like a Brett Favre sort of resurgence at the back end of last season. But Njoku, I do obviously...
Colm, in 2022, Joe Flacco put up worse numbers with the New York Jets than Zach Wilson.
Yeah.
For me, so the only reason I mentioned that Joe Flacco is terrible is because for me, it's a huge positive that David Njoku had such a good stretch with Flacco. And I take it as a very positive sign for both him and Amari Cooper that once they got reasonable QB play and it was no longer these third, fourth string hybrid types of running backs that they blew up. I mean, for me, you're going to get an actual NFL quarterback in 2024, and I think you're going to get production.
The interesting thing with both of those names, Ingram and Njoku, you mentioned like there's a year between them basically, Njoku being a year younger, but they have followed kind of similar paths where it's taken a long time to get to that breakout. There was a lot of hope for them coming in, but even if we look at like the one thing I'm just a little bit skeptical with Njoku is like, was that a run where that happened, or is that something that can be seen over the course of the rest of his career? So for that 1 year difference, like throughout his career, we have 287 receptions for Njoku to 449 for Ingram. And I do think that if I was picking one of those now, I'm probably going for Ingram because I'm looking at, and obviously we're saying this in a league that we're competing against people who are listening to the show, but he feels to me like the guy who you could move when it comes to October for future capital. But he also feels like somebody who can be that win now player for you this season. I do think just like, obviously there's a lot of his receptions last year were very short, but I think it's overlooked that what he was able to do last season. And the other part of it is like he had 4 touchdowns to end the season, but wasn't really getting into the end zone. If there's some regression towards that, I think that he could have a very interesting season again. I feel like his is more repeatable than what we've seen from Njoku.
I guess I don't think that his is that repeatable, but I do think that he has a much better floor. The issue with Ingram is that the Jaguars have now added back in better receivers, and so they won't have the same necessity.
But so have the Browns. They've added Jerry Jeudy.
You definitely got me with that one. Colm, I also wanted to ask you about a much younger tight end who broke out last season, we probably wouldn't need to take him until maybe the last in this stretch of picks. But Colm, 25 years old, was really good last year with Justin Fields, now has Caleb Williams. He is cheap in part because they have the 3-star receivers, but it would be surprising if Keenan Allen is there very long. An offense that features DJ Moore and Robert Dunze is not going to be one where defenses can focus overly on stopping Colm. That's one where 5 years from now, we could be saying we got 4 tight ends, 6 finishes, and he rises up to be, more or less a 5th round startup pick in this type of format.
The fun thing about this conversation, Shawn, is it feels like we're battling over these players that we don't want to draft, and then the players that we do want to draft, we're like talking about now. I feel like him, and I know I'm a bit higher on him, I think, than you are, but I think Musgrave, the two of those NFC North tight ends, are very, very interesting in this format. Again, players who I think can ascend in value and be useful this season for a roster like we have constructed. I think like the reason that the tight ends there we talked about in Njoku and Ingram, we're in a fortunate position at the minute where we have our pick here, then we don't have a pick, we're picking again in 2 picks time, then we don't have a pick, we're picking again in 2 picks time, and then we have a 4-pick gap. I think we have the ability to stick with the picks and see how it goes. I would be quite confident that some of those tight ends are making it to that 9-12, and I would imagine that we have the opportunity then to get them. But if it's a case that, let's say Musgrave went, we do have an opportunity here to pitch in and get Kmet with one of those picks. He would be, along with Musgrave, my preferred tight end target throughout this range. In this draft, again, with the RotoViz Overtime listeners, it may be a case that they also pass on the older tight ends. Like we're seeing that obviously Jacobs is still sitting there a little bit after ADP. So I think that's why we're seeing that kind of backlog of some of those older players linked in there. So I'm on board with Colm, but that's a pick I think at the 907 or the 912 that I would be looking to get in there. And I also like the fact that, we do have Brock Bowers and we're hoping he hits the ground running, but getting, somebody who's going to be a veteran part of an offense who's still young at the tight end position, I think makes sense for this roster. So I think we're both in agreement on that particular one. When we look though at the potential options, I don't know if we want to talk too much about the wide receiver ones, because this is a range where it's a veteran tier of wide receiver when we look at the next names on the list. So it's Godwin, Brown, Ridley, Allen. Then you get into the younger guys like Burton, Polk, Franklin, even Dotson. So I think that there's a chance that maybe you don't have to take wide receiver in this tier unless you think that there's one of those guys that we really have to pitch for in those next, 4 picks. I think we can probably avoid giving away our secrets at wide receiver. I guess that I'm thinking that we've talked ourselves out of we're certainly, after being talked out of the Chris Godwin conversation, Shawn may still pitch the Hollywood Brown conversation. Is there any other names that you want to discuss for this particular pick or through those next 4 picks?
Well, I don't think Jalen Polk is going to make it much farther with the camp buzz surrounding him and the situation there where they pull out of the Brandon Ayuk sweepstakes. He doesn't have the strongest profile. He was probably the weakest of the 3 Washington Huskies receivers. He was very inconsistent even last year when he got the opportunity with Jalen McMillan out. And yet what they spent on him and what they have otherwise at the receiver position would suggest that going forward, he will have to dramatically fail to not score as a rookie and likely as a second-year player, and therefore rise in value. There's also the element where you could simply be wrong on the evaluation, where his collegiate mediocrity was not the most relevant thing, or just he rises above that, right? People can change, people can improve. Just because we have a sense of the range of outcomes for a player based on what they have done in college doesn't mean that individual players can't get better or they couldn't hit on a 95th percentile outcome. When you combine that knowledge again with where they picked him, he's a player who probably is more expensive than this a year from now, almost regardless of what happens in 2024. There are other ways to play it where you take Baker later and just bet on maybe an equivalent guy who's a lot cheaper. But the Patriots don't have anything. And so if they get a decent combined season from Jacoby Brissett, who's played pretty well the last couple of years, and or Drake May, you do get some rookie year scoring and you gain a lot of ground in the trade market, which one of the things that we have discussed here, and even if you're not having to make these exact decisions, the reason hopefully this show is interesting to people when they're thinking about their dynasty roster is that you can see how it's difficult to squeeze additional trade value out of most of the rest of the guys in this range.
The other part I think is interesting with that is like I guess almost like a dynasty wide receiver cliff could be coming up at this particular point of the draft. There's a lot more veterans then as you move on through the draft and some of those later rookies and younger players. But I guess we will mention it. Troy Franklin was the other name that I mentioned. He goes usually as wide receiver 52 in this particular format in the 11th round, and then Polk goes 54 in the 12th round. So both of those guys, as we talk about drafting in the 9th round, they are the next wide receivers, along with Keenan Allen, Chris Godwin, Hollywood Brown, that would go off the board in that particular range. I would be much more happy to lean to those rookies for this particular build. Obviously, the other side of that is the points for this season. But as I mentioned, I still think there are rookies that will be going later in the draft that we can potentially add in for more 2024 points. But as I mentioned at the start, arriving early, I do think that some of these wide receivers that we have will have that ability this season as well. So those two wide receivers, Shawn, for me, definitely would skip the two wide receivers we talked about earlier, the veteran options in Brown and Godwin, up the queue. The other part then is if it was a case just strategically wise, if we did want to preference those with, the names that we mentioned for the running back spots were Chase Brown, Warren, and Tyjae Spears kind of been some of the, I think you might have pushed Warren a wee bit away for us on this one, but Brown and Spears, I think, are definitely there. Do we want to look at the prioritizing the wide receivers based on how wide receivers gone in the draft and the additional options that we have at running back, plus the fact that we do have a base of Etienne and Walker at a running back position? Do we want to prioritize getting Franklin or Polk on this particular roster at this particular pick and over the next couple of picks?
Yeah, I think so, because you have, as you mentioned, a variety
kind of some fallback
options. Yeah, who provide more or less the same thesis.
Same tier.
The same thing can't exactly be said for Polk, although Polk and Franklin potentially do some similar things for you. In the short term, Polk is more likely to gain trade value. Might be somebody that we turn around and move in this draft, whereas Franklin right now buried a little bit. It would be interesting to see how late we can get him. It probably won't be that late, but we can move that around a little bit. So it wasn't really the direction I thought we would go when we started the discussion, but Colm, are you ready to close out this Friday edition of RotoViz Overtime by clicking Jalen Polk with the 903?
I am. Again, a player that you mentioned all the concerns that we would have for him, but I still think that there's an immediate upside to him in this Patriots team for the start of this season. And you mentioned as well the potential rise in value even before the season starts to potentially move him. I do think then that we'll look into maybe one of those running backs over the course, but I'm still open to moving back in these picks as well, because I do think part of it is that those running backs may be available a couple of picks later. So happy to go with Polk, Shawn.
Yeah, I'm going to pull the trigger. So we have Jalen Polk. on Uncle Colm and the Spanish Armada, our RV Triflex startup team with the OT listeners. Again, thank you everyone who has participated in this league with us. It's been absolutely awesome. We encourage you to get out. I saw that the FFPC slow dynasty startups will be concluding soon. If you want to get in those, make sure you do it. Keep an eye out for the fast drafts. Those Fast and Furious with your dynasty startup is also going to be a blast. We'll be back with more best ball and redraft content. Colm, take us away.
Yeah, and the fast dynasty, Shawn, that I don't know if I felt anxiety there running through my body when Shawn mentioned that, but obviously a lot of fun in all the different formats. But yeah, we will close it there. Hopefully you've enjoyed listening to some of that strategic element for dynasty. It's always fun as well when myself and Shawn maybe don't fully agree on a player. We'll leave it at. But and I'm looking forward to getting Chase Brown here at the next selection as well onto this roster. But that is going to do it for today's edition of RotoViz OT. Hopefully you have enjoyed it. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at @OverToMartin. My co-host is Shawn Siegele. Check out Shawn's work up on rotoviz.com. And until we are back, have a good one.